Hi students, welcome to Year 11 Biology and Module 2, Organisation of Living Things. This is video number 13 and this time we're going to be looking at transpiration. Our goal is similar to the one that we looked at previously with photosynthesis, except that this time we're going to focus on the transpiration cohesion tension theory. So one of the things that we've been having a bit of a look at is how water moves through plants. Water is a critical substance that's needed by plants, most noticeably for things like photosynthesis, but also because it is such a great solvent, so that it enables it to be a transport medium, and also for things like keeping cells turgid, which helps for things like gas exchange. Water is an incredibly important substance for plants. Now, in aquatic plants, water and sometimes minerals too surround them, and they can be absorbed directly through the entire plant surface through things like diffusion or osmosis. And we've looked at those previously, so I won't spend too much time on those now. But what about terrestrial plants? Terrestrial plants are not always in an environment that has ready access to water, so they must obtain or draw in those water molecules and also the important nutrients that they need, and they do that primarily through the root system. So one of the things that we need to understand is this pathway of water, how water moves from the roots to the leaves. We know that in the leaves it's critical because this is the site of photosynthesis, and as water is one of our raw materials, we have to be able to get water from the roots up into the leaves. How does this happen? Well, there's a couple of very important processes, and the introduction to this video kind of gave you a little bit of a clue about that. Firstly, we have osmosis, which is the process of moving water from that high to low water concentration. And in order to help facilitate that, we also have one of our very important biological concepts, the idea of surface area to volume ratio. In order to increase this surface area to volume ratio, we find root hairs. And root hairs are a very important outgrowth of the epidermal cells in roots that helps to increase the surface area of the roots and therefore to increase efficiency of water absorption. So that gets the water into the roots, but what happens to it then? Well, there's a couple of additional types of ideas or theories about whether the water is moving from cell to cell or whether it actually migrates through the cell walls from cell to cell. But we won't worry too much about that here. We can have a bit more of a look at that in class. What we do need to understand is something about a couple of key properties of water that enables it to move through xylem vessels. Now, what's probably most interesting about this whole process is when you think that the xylem pretty much are almost just like straws that are sucking the water up from the roots to the leaves. And then you look out your window and you see the heights of some plants, some trees, and they are enormously high for us to be trying to pump this water or suck this water from the roots to the leaves against gravity. So there's a couple of things here that we need to talk about that kind of help with this process. One of these is called cohesion, and cohesion is about sticking together. So things cohere if one water molecule sticks to another water molecule. This is the sort of principle that we need when we're working together. We want a cohesive group. And the other thing that's important about water is it also has a property known as adhesion. And this is more about its general stickability. This is why your hands get wet when you put them in water. So water has a very good adhesive quality. That is, it's good at sticking to other surfaces. So if you like, cohesion is within water and adhesion is between water and other things, such as the walls of the xylem vessels. So we see almost this creeping of water going up, and you can see this in a capillary tube. So if you look at a capillary tube, which is a very thin tube, you can actually see that the water rises above the level of wherever the water might be elsewhere. Say if you put a capillary tube in a beaker, then in the beaker we might have a certain amount of water, but in the capillary tube, which is very thin, that level of water may be a little bit higher. And that's a result of cohesion and adhesion. But even these two very important qualities of water don't really explain this enormous movement up meters against the force of gravity. So we need another thing. We need transpiration. And the thing about transpiration or evapotranspiration is when water is moving out through the stomates of the leaves. We've talked about stomata before. We've talked about the fact that the water has to be in a gaseous form, so it's the gas that is going to diffuse out of the stomates. But what happens as a result of this is the stickability of water and its cohesive properties helps to exert a force, a tension force, a pulling force, if you like, in the same way that if you pulled a rope, you'd be pulling on each part of that rope, which would all be stretching it to a certain extent, as each individual part exerts a small, tiny, attractive force on each other. And that's what we see with water. Water molecules exert very tiny forces on each other, and they create what we call a tension. And this is one of the reasons why, in order to explain the movement of water against gravity up very, very long distances through the stems of plants like trees, we need to think about the osmotic diffusion of water into the roots from the soil. We need to think about the cohesive and adhesive properties of the water in its movement through the xylem, but we also need to think about the loss of water through transpiration through the stomata and how that creates tension on the water molecules in behind. So just as we looked at with photosynthesis, we do need to get a bit of a history associated with what's going on in terms of transpiration, cohesion, and tension. Now you will have a look at some material in class, but let's just try and summarize some of the key points here. Firstly, Dickson related water flow through xylem tissue as a result of transpiration, the evaporation of water through the stomata, which we've already talked about, cohesion, the attraction of water molecules to each other, and also tension, this negative pressure associated with the transpiration pull, which was then transmitted to the entire water column, all the way from the water molecules in the leaves through the xylem into the cells in the roots. Here you can see adhesion, which is water molecules sticking to another surface, another substance, and also cohesion, which is the attraction of water molecules for one another. In actual fact, this occurs through intermolecular forces known as hydrogen bonds. And this may be something that might be familiar to some of the chemists among you, but isn't a concept that we need to go into a lot of trouble learning for our biology course. One of the things that is important is that water molecules do stick to one another. We see this in surface tension, which we've talked about before, and we also see this in this property of cohesion, and as well as buoyancy, and also all three be explained by the attraction of water molecules for one another held together by these hydrogen bonds. So what this creates for us is a transpiration stream, and 5 kind of points I think might just wrap us up here today. The first is solar energy causes water to evaporate through the stomata. So this is the first step, transpiration. The rate of water evaporation is affected by things like air temperature, wind, light intensity, humidity, and you investigated some of these with the photometers earlier in the course. Secondly, the water that evaporates from the leaf cells that are in close contact with the xylem cells will draw water from those xylem vessels to replace water that's lost. This is the tension that we were talking about before. Cellulose in the cell walls connects kind of like blotting paper and sucking or drawing up that water from lower down. This creates this pull. This is the tension that we talked about before. This is the tension on all the water molecules that are moving this water up from the roots into the leaves and out through the stomata. Adhesive forces cause the attraction between the cellulose fibers of the xylem and the water molecules. And of course, it is cohesive forces that draw these two different water molecules to one another. Finally then, as the water molecules evaporate, they exert a pull on other molecules behind them, and that's the cohesive force that I talked about before that leads to this idea of capillarity, which is just the movement of the liquid through the very, very narrow tubes that we have that are what we call the xylem. And this enables the whole of this water column to progress from root to leaf. So rather than kind of being pushed, it's more being pulled out of the top or the leaves of the plant. Now there is a small amount of water that can also be pushed from the plant by root pressure, and we know that there is an osmotic pressure that is going to be pushing the water into the plant, and so we can kind of get a little bit of an upward push from the roots into the xylem vessels that are both within the roots and therefore moving up through the stem. But to get effective movement of water, this transpiration stream, flowing water from the soil through the root hairs into the roots, through the xylem in the stems, and out through those gas spaces between spongy mesophyll cells out into and through the stomata into the environment beyond. There's a lot of very important concepts associated with water movement in plants, and obviously we'll need to look at this in just a little bit more detail in class. Thanks for watching.